We're very excited to have Professor Saiph Savage talk to us today. Professor Savage is a professor at Northeastern University, and she conducts research in this intersection of human-computer interaction, AI, and civic technology. Professor Savage is also one of the 35 innovators under 35 by the MIT Technology Review, and the Google Anita Borg Scholarship recipient, and a fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Her work has been covered by many venues and published widely. For example, in the CHI conference, CSCW, the web conference, and many others. Her recent work actually won a Impact Award, and I'm hoping we're going to hear more about it today. And generally, Dr. Savage works on a bunch of topics related to human-centered design and AI in order to think about how to deliver better experiences and government services for citizens. All right, I think we can get started then. Thank you so much, Saiph, for being here with us. Let us know if you'd prefer any format of the questions, and in the meantime, you can take it away.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's talk. I've been a big fan of your seminars, and it's really an honor to be here and connect with you guys. And feel free when I'm giving my talk to ask questions. I'm happy to stop and have discussions, etc., or you can wait until the end, however you guys prefer. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Do you guys see my screen right now? Okay, yes. Great. Yes. And perfect. 1 sec. Sorry, 1 second. 1 second. Okay, great. So today I'm going to be presenting about how we can design artificial intelligence for the greater social good. And as I mentioned, currently I'm working at Northeastern University. I also collaborate closely with the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, where we have been doing a lot of work related to civic tech as well. So a question I'm very passionate about is thinking, how might we design AI for social good? When we start to think about this problem, I think something very important is to consider, well, AI on one hand has been creating these futuristic realities where we have self-driving cars that can take us from one place to another. We have voice assistants who can respond and understand almost anything that we're saying. And so we are living in the future. Now, it's true that AI has been displacing workers from their jobs, but the truth is also that AI has been creating millions of new jobs. A lot of these new jobs have to do with getting human workers to complete the tasks that are difficult for the machines to do. So we might have, for instance, human workers who are going to be labeling images. And through the labeling of images, the machine learning model will then be able to recognize, oh, this is a sign, this is not a sign. Similarly, other types of tasks that these workers might do involve transcribing audio. For instance, this way Alexa might be able to better understand what an end user is saying. Other types of tasks can involve categorizing content. Through this, for instance, Facebook might not show you posts filled with pedophilia or hate speech. Usually these workers who are operating behind the scenes and helping the machine learning models are invisible to the end user, and so they've also been called ghost workers. Ghost work is on the rise. It is expected that by 2027, 60% of the US workforce will be involved in these types of labor where you have human workers who are operating closely with the artificial intelligence and in order to improve it. And so a lot of research has gone into making these types of workflows much more efficient. We've invested a lot in reducing the cost involved with getting these human workers involved in the pipeline. And so we could say, hey, this is perfect. You know, AI is good. We're creating these futuristic realities. We're creating millions of new jobs. We've got this. AI is good. Yes, AI is good, but the reality is that AI is also creating a new global underclass. So my research has uncovered that a number of workers who are operating behind the scenes in our AI industry are paid less than minimum wage, and they also have limited opportunities to grow and develop themselves. And so this is why I'm very interested in thinking about, well, how might we design AI for good? What does this look like? I propose the following framework. I argue that in order to start to design AI for good, what we need to do is we need to start to understand people's values. We need to understand Also, what are the critical problems that people are facing? And by better understanding the different values that people have, as well as the critical problems that they're facing, we can then start to design AI for good. What does AI for good look like? For instance, tools that use deep learning to start to detect when an employer is being unfair for a worker so that the employer can get nudged and change their behavior, or using reinforcement learning models that learn through time the best ways that we can guide people to fight disinformation or develop certain skills. Now, in order to understand people's values, I'm using value-sensitive design. Value-sensitive design provides me with a nice framework where I can go from understanding people's values, designing technology that address people's values, and then being able to evaluate those tools that I built. And then understanding now, how do people react, their new values that they might develop with these tools. In order to understand the systematic problems that people are facing, I use Nussbaum's partial theory of justice. I'm connecting with critical theory research, which argues that when you're thinking about justice, it's not just thinking about whether or not people have access to the same amount of resources, but rather, what can people do with those resources and what can't they do with those resources? And then, so by understanding what, for instance, can people do, is that we can start to find what are the critical problems that people are facing. And I use that in my design to start to create tools that can start to address these different types of problems. And so I use my framework in order to identify critical problems, and then I start to design different types of tools. Today, I will be presenting about some of the research that I've done in developing tools for the invisible workers behind the machine. And so I use my framework, and I use my framework to understand the different values that people have and also the different problems that they face. I conduct interviews, I conduct surveys with the different stakeholders. I've also built tools through which I can quantify what is happening inside these digital labor markets. Because if you think about it, it's like a black box. We don't know what's going on. And so through my interview studies, I have been able to identify that the workers value earning fair wages, but they're earning currently less than minimum wage. And this was something that I was able to quantify with the tools that we built. Now, what's also interesting is that while the environment has been hard for workers in these digital labor markets, what we are also seeing is that a number of workers have been able to thrive. They have been able to earn good wages, and they have been able to obtain enjoyable experiences. And so based on this, I start to think about, well, a critical thing that we're identifying is that workers are earning less than minimum wage. So can we do something to help them start to increase their wages? Another critical problem that I identified was that workers were stuck with limited opportunities to grow and develop themselves. And so this is why I'm very interested in thinking about, well, let's start to address these problems. Let's start to create tools that can help workers to increase their wages. Let's develop tools that can help workers to develop their skills. And so in order to design this, one of the things that I do is that I take into consideration that some workers have been able to thrive on these platforms. We found that some workers are super Turkers and they are thriving, they're earning good wages. And so I propose the following approach. I'm going to find those workers who have been able to thrive, and then I'm going to computationally guide them so that they provide strategies about what exactly do they do on the marketplace so that they can thrive. Then these strategies are going to I'm going to give them to other workers, the novice workers. And I'm going to tell the novice workers, hey, follow these strategies so that you can also thrive. Great. And I mean, this is a pretty straightforward thing. And you would probably ask, well, where's the AI? Why involve AI? The thing is that not all of the strategies might work for all workers. It's possible that certain gems get lost in the muck. And so therefore, I propose to use a reinforcement learning model. The reinforcement learning model, what it's going to do is that it's going to learn through time what type of strategies do the other workers find most useful. The workers who receive the strategies are going to say, hey, this strategy worked. No, the strategy didn't work. And so you get a thumbs up, thumbs down. the machine in this case is going to aim to optimize to give strategies that the workers consider are helping them the most. And so through time, the machine is going to optimize for strategies that workers consider are the most helpful for them to thrive on the platform. And so through this, I was able to develop a machine learning model where it's going to learn what are the best strategies that we could give other workers so that they can thrive on the platform. Great. Now, once we have our machine learning model, there are different ways that we can go about it to implement it and start to change workers' lives. One way is, for instance, just create a whole new digital labor platform, and in the back end, we can put in the machine learning models that we want, and through this help workers to increase their wages, develop their skills so that they can follow those strategies. That's one way. And this was actually something that I did with Stanford's crowd research, where I built a whole new digital labor platform called Demo. However, a problem that exists with this approach is that you have to re-engineer a lot of things. You have to re-engineer basically everything in order to get the platform to start to work. Also, this means that you're wasting a lot of your time in re-engineering, creating the whole platform, and you have even less time to test out if your machine learning models actually work. It also takes you significant time to recruit employers, to recruit workers to get on your platform. It's also time that you're wasting, and it's less time for you to be able to test out if your machine learning models actually work, or do they actually help workers to develop their skills. Therefore, I propose the following. You know what? We're not going to create new digital labor markets. What we're going to do is instead, we're going to repurpose current digital labor markets so that they can meet the different needs that workers have. So I'm going to go with existing digital labor markets. This is the ones that exist within big tech. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be repurposing them. So how do we repurpose big tech? What I propose to use is our web plugins. The web plugins are going to be living on top of existing digital labor markets, for instance, Amazon Mechanical Turk, Upwork, Toloka. And what they're going to do is that the web plugin itself is going to have in the back end, the machine learning models that we create, and it's going to be pushing forward the different experiences that we want to facilitate for workers. And so this is an example of a digital labor market. Here, workers will be transcribing an image, and they'll be putting in, for instance, information about the image here. And then this is how it looks like with my web plugin. So my web plugin allows, basically it's this little interface where workers are going to be typing away the different strategies. They can then see the strategies that other workers have provided, and they just give a thumbs up, thumbs down. And notice that this allows them to stay directly within the digital labor market, and they don't have to go anywhere. They maintain themselves on the digital labor market. This way, we don't have to spend time recreating this whole digital labor market, recruiting employers, recruiting workers. This way we can focus more easily on testing out whether or not our interface works. And so given this, I create my web plugins, and then armed with my plugins, I see we have a raised hand.
Oh, just one question from me and from one of the participants who had messaged me earlier on maybe we can go a little bit into detail on the platform itself. I'm curious about how does this work with the interface between like jobs and workers, and yeah, thank you. And if you'd like to go, we can go a bit slower on some of this. If there's more questions popping up, we can catch those too.
Sounds great. So how this web plugin works, this one in particular was focused on, for a particular task, workers provide micro feedback. So we assume that the advice that workers are providing about how you can, for instance, develop your skill for a particular task, etc., is going to be an activity that you're going to be doing as a side activity. And so given this, we assume that people are just going to be providing rapid feedback about, okay, you know what, you have to do this to get better and faster at this particular task. Now, we also allow workers to provide advice. We also allow workers to provide advice when they're searching for work. So in the part where they're searching for work, it's very important to help workers to recognize with what employer should they work with what employer should they not work with. And so the plugin allows them to see as well, overlaid, okay, you know what, aim to work with these employers, don't aim to work with these other employers. And it's just, notice that it's just little feedback that they would see overlaid on directly on the interface of the platform. I don't know if we have other questions. I can't see the chat, but maybe we can do that dynamic about, like, for instance, you can raise your hand and I'm happy to stop and ask.
That sounds great. Definitely. Everyone, please feel free to add questions. Either raise your hand and we can all see you, or add to the chat and I will read your questions out loud.
Perfect. So now, once I had my web plugin finished, my next goal was to say, okay, does it work? Can we use this type of tool to help workers to develop their skills? Can we use this type of tool to help workers to increase their wages? How is my tool used in the real world? So for this purpose, I first conducted a field experiment to see if I could help workers to develop their skills. I recruited 90 workers and I divided them, real world crowd workers, and I divided them in 3 conditions. And I had them complete tasks. And one condition was the control. Workers are just working on their own on the tasks. Human coaching, where workers are receiving coaching from other workers, but there's no AI involved. And then we have the AI-based coaching, where the machine learning model is learning through time. What type of advice should we give workers so that they can develop their skills, that they can become faster? And it's learning that through time. So here are the results from our study. These are the different tasks that workers did. The y-axis is showing how much time it took them to complete the tasks. The y-axis here shows the accuracy. And what we're seeing overall is that with the intelligent systems, workers became faster and they maintained at least the amount of accuracy. And so if you think about skill development as becoming faster and better, we're seeing that we can start to help workers to start to become better at these types of jobs. Yes, I see we have a question.
One question from Olivia in the chat is whether this platform can accommodate workers from across domains such as energy, water, and other utilities.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was tested on Amazon Mechanical Turk. So it's primarily set for, and we tested it across all of the different tasks that exist on Amazon Mechanical Turk, because we also did a real world deployment where workers for different tasks could use it. So I would say that this is particularly, this tool right now is focused for crowd work. Crowd work involves labeling images, transcribing audio, for instance, completing surveys. So it's small tasks that workers do that feed into our AI models. And so we're right now focused on this population, but I think that it would be interesting to study in the future how it might transfer to other domains. Great question, Olivia. I see we have another question, Alexis.
Yes, ma'am. First of all, so far this is fascinating. Right up, I study underneath Dr. Rao, and we look into the ethics and stuff of AI. So really cool stuff here. I'm curious about the invisible worker. What were the demographics that you saw as far as like men versus women, education level? Did y'all factor in any demographic pieces like that, or was it more just a participant, seeing about the participants and stuff?
Yeah, that's also a very interesting question. So we actually have a paper that is looking at the differences about how do workers operate from rural areas, super rural areas, and also urban areas. So it depends a lot on the platform, the type of demographics that you find. On Amazon Mechanical Turk, we were actually finding a lot of Americans and Americans from both rural, super rural, and urban areas. And actually most of them had a college education. And so I think that's also important to consider, because many times when people think about crowd workers, they think about the invisible workers, they think about I don't know, highly uneducated people who are doing these jobs, and a lot of them have college education, and so you need to think about that when you're considering also what type of biases might they have when you're recruiting maybe a certain type of even specialized worker for doing certain tasks. And we found one of the things that we analyzed recently was the wages that, for instance, men versus women are obtaining, also the amount of invisible labor that they do. Invisible labor is work that workers have to do, but for which they're not paid. And so, for instance, women have traditionally done a great portion of invisible labor. For instance, in the home, women do a lot of invisible labor. It's work that's not getting paid or recognized. We were not finding so far as much differences between men versus women, but right now on Amazon Mechanical Turk, we are finding differences between workers who come from the US and workers from India, for instance. And I would say Amazon Mechanical Turk focuses primarily on US population and a little bit India. But the problem is that for international workers, Amazon Mechanical Turk, I think, is cutting them off. So there's a lot of jobs that international workers, even though they might have the credentials, they're not able to access. And so that hits the amount of wages that they do. And it also hits the amount of invisible labor that they have to do. Because, for instance, a worker might start doing a task and then at the end get asked to do something that's only available in the US, and so they don't get paid. And so that type of dynamic hits workers. An interesting new platform that I've been exploring is called the Toloka platform, which I highly recommend as well to see it. It's interesting because they're allowing more international workers on their platform, and they're taking a little bit more worker-centric focus.
Thank you so much. That's that's super fascinating. I didn't even, I think that men and women aside, the country differences is a really cool aspect to look into as well. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree. I think that aspect about the gender is very interesting. We are interested in studying that more. One thing to consider is also that crowd work, for instance, I think is becoming popular among women in terms of that it's a very flexible type of job. And so, for instance, we were interviewing single mothers who liked the work because it allowed them to be able to establish more time with their kids when they wanted. It was also, for instance, we had also rural moms. So the husband might have left for the city to find work. The rural moms stayed home, but they were then able to find jobs on these platforms and make an additional living to what their husband was giving them. And so it also gave them independence, and they liked that. And so I think further understanding those types of dynamics, I think, could be very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, okay, so we started finding, and great questions, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. So overall, we started finding that workers started with these types of tools to develop their skills. The next thing that we wanted to see was whether or not our tool could help workers to increase their wages. And so we conducted a similar experiment, a field experiment. Now we had two conditions: control and the AI-based coaching. And we followed workers for 2 weeks. Control, they're doing everything as normal. And in the AI-based coaching, they're receiving our different coaching tools. What we started to see was that workers started with our tool were able to increase their wages in difference to the workers in control conditions. There's still a lot to do. So, I mean, the wages that workers received, was still not, the hourly wage was still below. But it's promising that with these types of tools, we can help workers to start to increase their wages. And so that's promising. And so overall, we started to see that with these types of tools, we could help workers to develop their skills. We could also help workers to increase their wages. And it is also something that adapts to what the workers are doing in the real world. I think that there's a number of different directions that we can go with this space. For instance, one is also thinking about how we can take this into other domains, other platforms as well. For instance, Uber, Upwork. Also thinking about helping workers to obtain more specialized skills, as a person mentioned before. For instance, how would it look like if you want business communication skills, maybe something related with energy. And I think also there's value in thinking about how we can integrate employers, for instance, and the other actors of the ecosystem in these types of systems as well, so that we can create change not just with workers, but with the other actors. Now I'm going to briefly present a little bit about some of the research that we're doing around public interest infrastructure, because I think that's interesting for this audience. So again, I use my framework in order to understand the different values that people have, what are the critical problems that they're facing, and through that, I design my technology. On one hand, I think that when you're working on public interest infrastructure, something very important is to build collaborations. And so I have been able to connect with different local governments, as well different NGOs and civic organizations, so that we can test out our systems in the real world and with large scale actors. We were also able to establish a formal collaboration between my alma mater, where I also collaborate with UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so that we can design technology together, for instance, for immigrants, and just starting to address problems at scale. So I think that there's a lot of value when you're working in public interest infrastructure to find those key actors that can help you in pushing forward your technologies. We're also working closely with the United Nations Accelerator Lab, and with them we've been able to as well deploy the systems that we were building in the real world. So one project that I think was going to be interesting for your community was a project that we have with Mexico's Ministry of Energy. And here, one of the things that we have been looking at is how do you design efficient technology for rural regions? So one big issue that we were having, that the government was having, was they would buy, for instance, efficient stoves from Europe, take them to these rural regions in Mexico, and then they would never be used. And the population would continue putting their health in danger because they wouldn't use those efficient stoves. And so one of my students, who's actually now the director of clean energies in Mexico's Ministry of Energy, he spent years actually in these communities to really understand them. And he came up with a design of a new type of efficient stove. Some of the things that he realized was that these communities are primarily driven by women. And so given that they're driven by women, the men are rarer because the men leave to work in the city, or even they leave to work in the US. So one of the things that they're doing is that the efficient stoves get built with clay. By building the stoves with clay, it allows, for instance, if there is something that the woman needs to change, she has the physical capabilities to be able to modify the stoves to better meet her needs. By using clay, they were also able to adapt the stove to meet the cultural heritage that these women, who are actually, most of them are from indigenous community, might have around how they're preparing their food. So for instance, their stoves needed a huge type of heater, which is very different than the European style heater, where you might have a small just a small heater for the food. And so he was able to adapt the efficient stove to meet also the traditions that these people had. He also made it into a participatory way where the community comes together to build the stove. And by turning it into a participatory way, he was able to get the community to participate in the process. And by participating in the process, the community and the family who got the stove felt more committed to using the stove long term, because the whole community had come help them. So now they had to use the stove. And so it was a way in which they were able to get longer term adoption. And so this is actually the student, Walter. Now he's the director of clean energies. And it has been very helpful to create these types of collaborations in order to build these types of technologies and get them deployed at scale. So now he's working here with Mexico's Ministry of Energy. And I thought that was an interesting type of collaboration that I thought your community would be interested in. We've also been collaborating with Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And similarly, my students have been creating different virtual assistants that can help government workers to take on the different load that they might have. And so the government worker dispatches or delegates to the virtual assistant jobs that might be very repetitive for them, and the virtual assistant helps them in completing those tasks. The virtual assistants were designed based on culture theory, and so I think that there's a lot of value in integrating culture into the design of the type of civic tech that you do. Similarly, we have also been working with Mexico's Ministry of Women. And with them, some of the things that we have been creating are intelligent dashboards. So the Ministry of Women has a space where domestic violence victims can come in and ask for help. The problem was that the government workers were having a very hard time giving the victims of domestic violence follow-up. And so we created intelligent dashboards through which the government workers can better identify who they should give follow-up to. Additionally, these interactive maps are also giving emotional support to the government worker, considering that, for instance, several of the government workers might be attending, for instance, a number of women who are in danger of even being murdered. And so that can have a high toll on them emotionally. And so we started exploring interfaces that could provide that type of emotional support to the government worker. Similarly, another project that I'm interested in this space, it has been around designing national research infrastructure. So if you think about it right now, who has access to the data and the computation are large technology companies. And so this can really limit the type of research that we can do. And so with Mexico's presidency and also the Federation of American Scientists, I've been starting to explore national research infrastructure where we can share data with the different actors and we can help them to get on board and start to do research together. This is academia, for instance, startups, NGOs, and all of them working together to now make better decisions through these types of collaborations, and also have new types of research by facilitating the computation and the data. I'm going to briefly now present other research that I've done for workers. So right now I presented a case study around invisible workers. Then I went a little bit through how to design for public infrastructure, considering that especially this audience might be interested in that. And then I'm going to right now present a little bit more around how to design for workers. And so this is one project that I have been involved in is around being able to quantify what happens in digital labor platforms. Right now, if you think about it, digital labor platforms are a black box. We don't know the type of wages that workers are receiving, the type of even the type of employers that exist. And so I think that by bringing transparency, we can start to change the dynamics on these platforms. And so this is a tool that we built to start to measure the amount of invisible labor that workers have to do. So here, for instance, this is where workers are searching for tasks in this case, on Amazon Mechanical Turk. One thing to consider is that when workers are searching for tasks, that's time in which they're not getting paid. So for instance, normally a person who works in an office, they might, for instance, sit at their desk and start to think about what they're going to do in the day. That's time where you're normally paid. Crowd workers are not paid for that time. Similarly, for instance, your Uber driver might have to wait for you to come out of your home, or they're waiting in their car to find what is going to be the next ride that they're going to take. All of that is time that they're not getting paid. And traditionally, workers would get paid. And so we started to explore now web plugins where we could quantify the amount of time that workers pass on these different types of activities. And so, for instance, here we see, so a worker it has our plugin in the back end, And while they're doing different tasks, our plugin is measuring. For instance, okay, you know what, you spend that much time searching for work, that much time looking at your profile, and all of that is time for which you're not getting paid. And we believe that by being able to measure, for instance, the amount of time that workers have to do for unpaid tasks, it can be a way in which we can then go to policymakers and say, hey, you know what, look at all of this work that the worker had to do and which they're not getting paid. We need to start to change this dynamic. And so, for instance, here we created like a little dashboard where workers can start to just see like, oh, you know what, I spend this much time on my profile of crowd work. That was time that I was not paid. I also spent this much time searching for work. I was also not paid, and actually working and receiving money, it was this much time. And so this can help workers to better manage their times, but also realize when companies, these large companies like Amazon, who gains a lot of money, are being unfair with them. And then another type of work that I've been doing is around helping to detect when an employer, a client, a customer is being unfair to a worker, and then nudging them so that they can reconsider how they treat workers. Why is this important? Many times, just by receiving one bad review, it can mean that the worker is going to be terminated. For instance, let's say a bad review, let's say of an Uber driver is they got stuck in traffic. And so they got stuck in traffic and a person writes a very nasty review about them. That one bad review that they received can mean the termination of the Uber driver. And so one of the things that we have been exploring are interfaces through which we can detect when an employer writes a bad review, an unjust review about a worker, and they are nudged to reconsider their review. And we tested this out within different platforms, gig work platforms, and we were able to see that Uber, Grubhub, Upwork, we were able to see that through these types of tools, we can help employers to reconsider their review. So here's a short little video of how this works. So for instance, a person is writing a review, and they write maybe like because they're blaming the driver because they got stuck in a bad route. The system then detects that and nudges the person, just creates the nudges, just looks like a short little message where they tell them like, hey, reconsider. I mean, getting a bad route, that's not the fault of the worker. They were just following what the algorithm told them. And so here the person, the person reconsiders their review and maybe writes a more positive review. And this is similarly how it worked on Grubhub. Notice that all of these tools are again working as web plugins so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but rather we allow, we can operate within existing digital labor markets. Similarly, now when we're thinking about designing for workers so that they don't lose, so that they're not displaced by AI, a very important thing is helping workers to develop their creativity. And so we started exploring how we could integrate play and creativity into crowd work. And so we created a tool called Turker Tales, where workers are doing tasks, and while they're doing tasks, they can write short stories and read short stories that other people have written. And so through this, we start to integrate play and creativity into crowd work. Similarly, we've also been exploring how we can help workers to take ideas that they might have and then be able to actually build their own digital labor markets. This is important because you can think that maybe workers have very unique ways in which they might be thinking about transforming and improving their workspace. Why don't we empower them to be able to create those spaces? And so that we started exploring that as well with this tool called MetaGig, where we help workers to start to just physically create the type of digital labor markets that they want. And again, we assume that workers might not have the technical skills to build their own digital labor markets. And so we obtain their information about what they're doing on a survey, and then we use web plugins to actually create that digital labor market for them based on their ideas. And so overall, we see that the importance of how by combining people's values and understanding the critical problems that they're facing, we can start to design technology for them that addresses the different problems that they're facing. And I also want to mention one of my collaborators, which is Toloka. They're another type of digital labor market. Mentioned that they have right now a number of grants that they're giving people. And so if you want to participate, you can also get some credits if you want to try out their own digital labor market. They're very much more worker focused, and so it can be an interesting platform as well to explore. What's also interesting about them is that they have more workers who are international workers, and so I think understanding those dynamics is also interesting. And so special thanks to all of my amazing collaborators, and thank you again very much for inviting me to be here. It was such a great honor. Thank you.